The skies over North Vietnam were stained with contrails and gunpowder. An invisible war map stretched across the stratosphere. It was August 23, 1967, and the air was thick with tension and jet fuel. In the high-speed chessboard of aerial combat, the United States Air Force believed itself to be the Grand Master, armed with the finest aircraft, trained in the most sophisticated dogfighting tactics, and reinforced with layers of strategic intelligence and overwhelming firepower. Their confidence wasn't misplaced. The F-4 Phantom II was the pride of American air dominance, fast, brutal, and intimidating. It could break the sound barrier with ease, launch a payload of air-to-air missiles from miles away, and still have enough thrust to dance out of a skirmish before enemy radar caught its tail. American pilots, many of them veterans of Korea, flew with a sense of inherited invincibility. After all, no one had ever matched them in the sky. Not really, not for long, but war, especially air war, is not just a contest of machines. It is a battle of wits, of deception, of raw instinct. On that morning, as the first wave of American strike packages crossed into enemy airspace, the tone was routine. Recon planes had scanned the path, identifying minimal SAM threats. Radar jamming escorts had done their jobs. The MiG bases, as far as satellite intelligence reported, were quiet. Too quiet. That silence should have been a warning. In the shadows of Than Hoa's mountains and the mist-shrouded runways of Phuc Yen, the NVAF had been watching, studying, waiting. Inspired by the infamous Operation Bolo, an American ruse executed months earlier where F-4 aircraft disguised their radar signatures to lure MiG-21s into a trap, the North Vietnamese had crafted a reverse deception, a counter-lure, a deadly echo. They called it Bolo 2.0. Their strategy was simple in its brilliance: mislead the USAF into thinking they were chasing down helpless bombers or retreating MiGs, when in fact they were being drawn into a kill zone meticulously designed to trap, disorient, and destroy them. For weeks, NVAF ground crews had broadcast misleading radio chatter, decoys disguised as unarmed flights, dummy aircraft lit up radar screens, and false distress signals baited American pilots to chase ghosts across the sky. But on August 23rd, those phantoms became fangs. 6 MiG-21s from the elite 921st Fighter Regiment were scrambled before dawn. Their pilots, men like Nguyen Van Kok and Lê Hai, were hardened veterans trained in Soviet doctrine, but sharpened in Vietnam's brutal air battles. They knew their aircraft's limitations. The MiG-21 couldn't match the Phantom's raw power, but they also knew its strengths: speed, agility, and a near-invisible radar profile. Like vipers in the mist, they struck when least expected and vanished before retaliation could land. In the American cockpits, everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. At 0942 hours, the lead element of Phantom IIs, call sign Viper Flight, reported radar contact with what they believed were retreating MiG-17s heading north. Orders came to pursue. Throttles pushed past Mach 1.2, the F-4s banked into a climb, engines screaming against the resistance of thinning air. Then, the trap closed. Out of the sun came the MiGs, diving hard and fast, their R-3S Atoll missiles already locked. The Phantoms had no time to react. The first missile slammed into the right engine of the lead F-4, tearing off its tail. A fireball erupted in the sky, trailing debris as the two-man crew ejected into a flak-filled horizon. Another Phantom turned sharply, chasing a MiG in a wide loop, only to find himself bracketed by 2 more enemy fighters, one above, one below. The NVAF pilots used a technique borrowed from Soviet doctrine called the vertical bracket, where one MiG climbed and the other dove, forcing the American to split attention between threats. In the split second it took to choose a target, both MiGs fired. One missile missed, the other didn't. By 0950 hours, 5 American aircraft were downed. 2 more limped back across the border, smoking and crippled. Their pilots, survivors of a stunning ambush, radioed in disbelief. "This isn't possible," one pilot said over open comms. "They knew we were coming." And they had. The NVAF had tapped into a vulnerability the Americans hadn't considered: their own confidence. From Soviet advisors in Hanoi to radar operators hidden in jungle shelters, the operation had been months in the making. It wasn't about brute force. It was about psychological warfare. The NVAF didn't need to win every fight. They just had to make America doubt the outcome. And it worked. In the Pentagon, the after-action reports arrived like thunderclaps. Senior officers studied the wreckage photos, the voice transcripts, the satellite recon of scorched jungle landing zones. Questions were asked. How had the NVAF anticipated the flight paths? Why hadn't the ECM, electronic countermeasures, blocked the ambush? And most, haunting of all, were the MiG pilots simply better? The answer was complicated. The MiG pilots weren't better across the board, but they had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought their opponents on this day. They had used deception the way a samurai uses a feint, not to dodge, but to strike. They had redefined air combat in the most brutal way possible. Operation Bolo 2.0 became more than just a dogfight. It became a legend. A moment etched in aviation history where the hunter became the hunted, where the underdog landed a punch that shattered the illusion of air supremacy. And somewhere, high above the Mekong Delta, a single MiG-21 banked hard left into the clouds, trailing smoke from its tail but victorious. He'd live to fight another day. Throughout the Vietnam War, the United States Air Force, USAF, conducted relentless bombing campaigns over North Vietnam, targeting critical infrastructure, supply routes, and military installations. The primary aircraft for these missions was the Republic F-105 Thunderchief, affectionately known as the Thud. Designed for high-speed, low-altitude penetration, the F-105 was capable of delivering substantial ordnance loads. However, its operational profile often brought it within range of North Vietnamese anti-aircraft artillery and the emerging threat of surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. To protect these bombers from enemy interceptors, the USAF deployed the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II as an escort fighter. The F-4 was a versatile and powerful aircraft, boasting impressive speed, advanced radar systems, and a formidable array of air-to-air missiles. Its primary mission was to engage and neutralize any North Vietnamese MiG fighters that threatened the strike formations. The North Vietnamese Air Force, NVAF, recognizing their limitations in both technology and numbers, adopted asymmetric aerial tactics to counter the superior American forces. Rather than engaging in direct confrontations, NVAF pilots employed guerrilla-style strategies. Hit-and-run attacks. NVAF MiGs would rapidly engage USAF formations, often targeting bomb-laden F-105s, and then quickly disengage before American fighters could effectively respond. Baiting tactics. They would feign retreat or vulnerability, luring American fighters into prearranged ambush zones where other MiGs or ground-based defenses awaited. Exploiting predictable flight paths. By studying the consistent routes and tactics of USAF missions, the NVAF set up effective traps, capitalizing on the Americans' operational predictability. In response to these challenges, the USAF devised Operation Bolo in January 1967. Spearheaded by Colonel Robin Olds, this operation aimed to deceive the NVAF by mimicking the flight patterns of F-105 bombers with F-4 Phantoms, thereby luring MiGs into combat under false pretenses. The mission was a resounding success, resulting in the destruction of several MiG-21s without any USAF losses. However, the NVAF learned from this experience. By mid-1967, they began formulating a counter-strategy to exploit the USAF's growing overconfidence. Recognizing that they couldn't match the Americans in firepower, They focused on outsmarting them. This culminated in the events of August 23, 1967, where the NVAF executed a meticulously planned ambush against USAF fighters, turning the tables and delivering a stark lesson in the evolving nature of air combat. This chapter in aerial warfare underscores the dynamic interplay of strategy, technology, and psychology, highlighting that in the theater of war, adaptability and cunning can rival even the most formidable arsenals. In the evolving aerial chess game over North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Air Force, NVAF, recognized the need to adapt their tactics to counter the technologically superior United States Air Force, USAF. Learning from previous encounters, particularly the USAF's successful Operation Bolo in January 1967, the NVAF devised a cunning strategy to lure American pilots into a meticulously planned ambush. Setting the stage by mid-1967, the NVAF had observed that American pilots, buoyed by their technological advantages and recent successes, often exhibited aggressive pursuit behaviors when engaging enemy aircraft. The NVAF aimed to exploit this predictability. Their plan involved creating the illusion of vulnerability to entice USAF fighters into a trap. The deceptive maneuver. On August 23, 1967, the NVAF initiated their operation with a series of calculated moves. 1. Low-altitude approach. A squadron of MiG-21s and MiG-17s took off from concealed bases deep within North Vietnam. Instead of climbing to engage the incoming American aircraft directly, they maintained a low-altitude flight path. This approach minimized their radar signature, effectively rendering them invisible to USAF radar systems and airborne early warning aircraft. 2. Electronic deception. Simultaneously, the NVAF employed electronic warfare techniques by transmitting fake radar signals. These deceptive blips on radar screens suggested the presence of a small, retreating group of MiGs. The intent was to present a tantalizing target that appeared to be fleeing, thereby playing into the American pilots' expectations of an easy engagement. 3. Deployment of decoys. To further the illusion, the NVAF dispatched older aircraft as decoys, flying them in patterns consistent with a retreating force. These decoys were meant to be visually and electronically detected by the USAF, reinforcing the narrative of a vulnerable enemy on the run. The bait is taken. The USAF, interpreting the radar signals and visual sightings as an opportunity, responded predictably. F-4. Phantom II fighters tasked with air superiority and eager to capitalize on what seemed to be a disorganized enemy retreat, accelerated to intercept and engage the perceived fleeing MiGs. The Phantoms, armed with advanced air-to-air missiles and confident in their capabilities, pursued the NVAF decoys with the expectation of achieving swift victories, springing the trap. Unbeknownst to the American pilots, their pursuit led them into a pre-designated kill zone. As the F-4s closed in on the decoys, ambush activation. The low-flying MiG-21s and MiG-17s, previously undetected due to their radar-evading approach, rapidly gained altitude and positioned themselves advantageously behind the pursuing Phantoms. Coordinated assault. With the element of surprise and superior positioning, the NVAF pilots launched a coordinated attack. Utilizing their aircraft's agility and the close-range advantage, they fired infrared-guided missiles and engaged with cannon fire. The sudden and unexpected assault disrupted the American formation and inflicted significant damage, aftermath, and tactical implications. The ambush on August 23, 1967, served as a sobering reminder to the USAF of the perils of underestimating an adaptive adversary. The NVAF's successful deception highlighted the effectiveness of combining electronic warfare, psychological manipulation, and tactical ingenuity. This engagement underscored the necessity for the USAF to continually evolve its tactics and maintain vigilance against complacency in the dynamic environment of aerial combat. This episode exemplifies how, in warfare, innovation and adaptability can offset technological disparities, turning perceived weaknesses into strategic advantages. On August 23, 1967, during the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese Air Force, NVAF, executed a meticulously planned ambush against United States Air Force, USAF, F-4 Phantom II fighters. This operation showcased the NVAF's tactical ingenuity and highlighted vulnerabilities in the USAF's operational strategies. The ambush unfolds. As the USAF F-4 Phantoms accelerated toward what they believed were retreating NVAF aircraft, the North Vietnamese sprung their trap. 1. Surprise engagement. Utilizing ground-controlled radar guidance, NVAF MiG-21s approached the American formation undetected. Exploiting the USAF's focus on the apparent fleeing MiGs, the MiG-21s positioned themselves advantageously. 2. Coordinated attack. The MiG-21 pilots executed a supersonic hit-and-run assault. One MiG-21 launched an AA-2 Atoll infrared-seeking air-to-air missile, successfully striking an F-4 Phantom and resulting in its destruction, exploiting formation vulnerabilities. The USAF F-4s were flying in close formation to maximize their radar jamming measures against surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. This tight formation limited their maneuverability and made them more susceptible to the NVAF's ambush tactics. Tactical outcomes. The NVAF's ambush resulted in significant consequences. USAF losses. The USAF lost multiple F-4 Phantoms during this engagement, marking a notable success for the NVAF. NVAF execution. The NVAF's ability to coordinate ground radar guidance with aerial tactics demonstrated their evolving proficiency in air combat operations. Implications. This engagement underscored several critical aspects of aerial warfare. Adaptability of adversaries. The NVAF's shift from conventional engagements to sophisticated ambush tactics highlighted their capacity to learn and adapt in response to previous encounters. Importance of situational awareness. The USAF's focus on the decoyed MiGs led to a lapse in detecting the real threat, emphasizing the need for comprehensive situational awareness in combat scenarios. Formation vulnerabilities. While close formations provided advantages in electronic countermeasures, they also presented exploitable weaknesses, as demonstrated in this ambush. This encounter serves as a poignant example of how tactical innovation and deception can effectively counter technological and numerical superiority in warfare. The aftermath of the August 23, 1967 engagement marked a significant shift in the aerial dynamics of the Vietnam War. The unexpected and devastating success of the North Vietnamese Air Force, NVAF, had profound effects on both the morale of the combatants and the strategic calculations of the United States. Shock and reassessment. When the first reports filtered back to United States Air Force, USAF headquarters, the shock was palpable. The American military had long believed that their technological and numerical superiority would guarantee success in any air combat engagement, especially over Vietnam. Yet, on that day, the NVAF had turned the tables with cunning tactics and careful deception. In the eyes of the USAF command, what had seemed like a routine bombing mission quickly spiraled into an ambush of devastating effectiveness. The loss of multiple F-4 Phantom II fighters was a humiliation, particularly as the engagement unfolded with the USAF pilots being outsmarted rather than outgunned. The ambush tactics employed by the North Vietnamese MiG pilots, who had baited their American counterparts into a carefully planned kill zone, had exploited several key vulnerabilities in the USAF's approach. For instance, the F-4s, heavily reliant on their radar and missile systems, found themselves at a severe disadvantage when they were led into a scenario where their radar-guided missiles were less effective against the low-altitude, high-maneuverability tactics of the MiGs. The failure to anticipate such a sophisticated ambush forced USAF commanders to reevaluate their approach to combat over North Vietnam. Previously, they had assumed that sheer technological advantage would be enough to secure victories. But the events of August 23rd made it clear that the war was not a straightforward contest of firepower. The NVAF, despite being outmatched in terms of equipment, had demonstrated that tactical ingenuity, deception, and psychological warfare were just as potent as any missile or machine gun. Psychological impact on the USAF. For the USAF pilots involved in the engagement, the aftermath was just as crushing. While American air superiority had been largely unchallenged in previous engagements, the loss of experienced pilots and high-tech aircraft signaled a shift in the balance of power. Many of the pilots involved in the ambush had been highly trained, accustomed to outmaneuvering enemy aircraft and dominating the skies. However, on that fateful day, they had been outmaneuvered by a far smaller and less technologically advanced force. This defeat led to a significant loss of confidence within the USAF. Questions began to surface within the ranks about whether the United States had underestimated the capability and resilience of the North Vietnamese. The realization that their opponents could not only survive but effectively engage in large-scale aerial combat was a tough pill to swallow for many in the USAF. The loss of several aircraft and pilots also led to a reassessment of tactics, with a new focus on adaptability and improved countermeasures in future engagements. On the flip side, the victory was a massive morale booster for the North Vietnamese. For a country fighting a desperate war against a global superpower, this success proved that they were not doomed to failure. The victory was a symbol of resilience and tactical brilliance, a shining example of how determination and ingenuity could overcome overwhelming odds. In a war where the NVAF had been outclassed by the USAF in terms of technological superiority, this engagement shifted the narrative. The North Vietnamese had not only survived the American onslaught, but had struck back with a level of precision and strategy that left their adversaries reeling. For the NVAF pilots who participated in the operation, it was a moment of pride. They had executed a flawless ambush, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, the USAF's operational habits, and their own strengths to outmaneuver their enemies. This victory showed that even against superior technology, their adaptability and cunning could win the day. The psychological impact was immense, not just for the pilots but for the entire nation. It reinforced the belief that despite being outgunned and outnumbered, the North Vietnamese could indeed take on the world's most powerful air force and emerge victorious. Strategic shift for the USAF. In the immediate aftermath of the ambush, USAF planners knew that they could not afford to repeat the mistakes of August 23rd. They began to rework their strategies, placing a greater emphasis on counterinsurgency tactics, electronic warfare, and psychological operations. No longer would they rely solely on their technological superiority to ensure victory in the skies. The lessons learned from this ambush would influence the rest of the war, forcing the USAF to adopt a more nuanced and versatile approach to combat. One of the immediate changes was the implementation of new air combat strategies, including improved formation tactics and better integration of support aircraft. The USAF also began to reconsider its reliance on high-tech weaponry and placed more focus on the experience and adaptability of the pilots themselves. The ambush had shown that even the best technology could be rendered ineffective by an intelligent and determined adversary. Moreover, the air war over North Vietnam was now seen as a more complex and dangerous environment. The NVAF had proven that they could counter the USAF's superior technology with strategic planning and effective use of deception. The threat of ambushes and the use of unconventional tactics were now taken more seriously, leading to a shift in USAF operational priorities. The larger impact on the Vietnam War. The effects of this engagement extended beyond just the aerial battlefield. The ambush reinforced the broader strategy of the North Vietnamese, who were fighting a war of attrition. They understood that they could not match the United States in terms of sheer military strength, but through patience, deception, and strategic innovation, they could turn the tide in their favor. This engagement helped solidify the belief that the United States, despite its overwhelming firepower, could still be beaten by a tenacious, resourceful adversary. In the broader context of the Vietnam War, the ambush had far-reaching implications. The United States had entered the conflict expecting a quick victory, but as the war dragged on, it became clear that the North Vietnamese were far more resilient and capable than originally anticipated. The ambush served as another reminder that the war was not just about superior firepower. It was about the will to fight, the ability to adapt, and the determination to win. For the USAF, the events of August 23, 1967, were a harsh wake-up call. They had underestimated their enemy and failed to adapt quickly enough to the evolving tactics of the NVAF. But the lessons learned in the wake of the ambush would ultimately shape the future of American air combat strategy. For the North Vietnamese, it was a moment of triumph, a victory that proved their ability to not only survive, but to dominate the skies against all odds. This ambush, now known as the Operation Bolo 2.0, became a symbol of how determination, intelligence, and strategic innovation could overcome even the most powerful of adversaries. The hunters had become the hunted, and in the process, they had changed the course of aerial warfare over North Vietnam. The ambush on August 23, 1967, over North Vietnam, where the North Vietnamese Air Force, NVAF, successfully executed one of the most sophisticated and well-executed traps in the history of air combat, offers critical lessons in aerial warfare that remain relevant today. The outcome of the battle, where a small and outgunned force of MiG pilots turned the tables on the technologically superior United States Air Force, USAF, was a watershed moment not just for the conflict in Vietnam, but for air combat strategy worldwide. The events of that day underscored a series of essential principles that all military forces, and particularly those involved in aerial warfare, must understand. These lessons would go on to shape future tactics and doctrine, influencing the way air forces approach combat to this day. Never underestimate your enemy. The first and most glaring lesson from the ambush was the crucial importance of never underestimating your enemy. The United States, with its overwhelming technological superiority in the skies, had long believed that its dominance in air combat was unchallenged. The MiG-21s and MiG-17s of the North Vietnamese were seen as antiquated compared to the cutting-edge F-4 Phantoms of the USAF. The belief within the USAF was that a confrontation with these older aircraft would be little more than a formality. After all, the American aircraft had superior radar systems, more advanced missile technology, and faster speeds. However, on August 23rd, the North Vietnamese demonstrated that technological disparity alone does not guarantee victory in combat. The NVAF pilots had spent years refining their tactics, learning how to exploit the weaknesses of their more advanced opponents. They understood the terrain, the behavior of American pilots, and most importantly, how to lure their adversaries into an advantageous position where their superior numbers and cunning strategies could overwhelm even the most technologically advanced aircraft. This principle of never underestimating an opponent, no matter how seemingly outclassed, is a vital lesson for all armed forces. In this instance, the USAF's confidence in their superior firepower and technology blinded them to the ingenuity of their opponents. The battle proved that when faced with an adaptive and creative enemy, even the best technology can fail if it is not supported by sound tactics and an understanding of the broader strategic picture. Overconfidence can be your downfall. The second lesson to be drawn from the ambush is the peril of overconfidence. For the United States, the belief that the NVAF would be easily defeated, or at least outgunned, became a fatal flaw. The USAF had experienced years of near-constant superiority in air combat, and they had learned to expect easy victories in the skies over Vietnam. With superior aircraft, missiles, and radar, the USAF believed they could quickly outmaneuver and overwhelm the North Vietnamese. This overconfidence was compounded by the USAF's failure to anticipate that the NVAF might use deception and misdirection as part of their tactics. When a group of MiG-21s and MiG-17s stayed low to the ground and avoided radar detection, it was an unexpected move for the American pilots, who had grown accustomed to fighting adversaries who engaged them head-on. The trap that was laid out was not one of brute force but of deception, using American expectations against them. When the Americans fell for this bait-and-switch tactic, they paid a heavy price. Overconfidence led to a false sense of security, and the USAF pilots, who had long been trained to expect dominance in the air, became complacent in their tactics. They failed to question their assumptions and did not consider the possibility that the North Vietnamese could devise such a complex and effective strategy. This dangerous assumption was one of the primary reasons the ambush succeeded. The impact of this lesson extends beyond military combat. Overconfidence can lead to mistakes in almost any context, whether in business, politics, or personal life. It can cloud judgment, make one overlook key vulnerabilities, and prevent proper preparation. The aftermath of this ambush serves as a stark reminder that confidence must be tempered with vigilance, humility, and the recognition that no opponent should ever be underestimated. Superior tactics can defeat superior technology. The third lesson, and perhaps the most significant, is that superior tactics can defeat superior technology. The NVAF was never going to outmatch the USAF in terms of sheer technological power. The F-4 Phantom, with its advanced radar, missile systems, and speed, was far superior to the MiG-21 or MiG-17 on paper. However, in this case, the North Vietnamese pilots demonstrated that technology alone does not guarantee success in aerial warfare. Their tactics, using deception, baiting, and ambushes, were far more effective than simply relying on superior firepower. In fact, the ambush relied on the understanding of the limitations of technology. The MiGs knew they could not go toe-to-toe with the F-4s in a straight-up dogfight, so they lured them into a kill zone where their technological advantages could be negated. By staying low and using the terrain to their advantage, the NVAF MiG pilots turned the tables and used the Americans' reliance on technology against them. It was a textbook example of how military forces can defeat superior weapons through the effective use of tactics. This lesson continues to resonate in modern warfare. In a world where technology constantly evolves, it is easy to place an overemphasis on the latest gadgets and equipment. However, history has repeatedly shown that wars are not won by technology alone. The soldiers, sailors, and pilots who adapt to changing conditions, who learn to use their environment and their opponent's weaknesses to their advantage, are the ones who succeed. Technology can give an edge, but it is tactical innovation and the ability to think outside the box that often make the difference between victory and defeat. A case study for future generations, the engagement of August 23, 1967, became a case study that would be analyzed by generations of fighter pilots, military strategists, and historians. It became a prime example of how a technically inferior force could, through skill, strategy, and psychological warfare, turn the tide against a more powerful adversary. For years, air forces around the world would study the tactics employed by the NVAF. trying to understand how they had outsmarted their technologically superior foes. The lessons learned from this ambush are still relevant today, whether it's in the form of unconventional warfare, asymmetric tactics, or the art of deception. The key takeaways from this engagement continue to shape how modern air forces and military organizations operate. The principles of not underestimating the enemy, avoiding overconfidence, and emphasizing the importance of tactics over raw firepower are integral to successful military operations in any era. Moreover, the August 23rd ambush forced the United States to reassess its assumptions about air superiority. The USAF, once so confident in its dominance, would never again approach the skies over Vietnam, or any battlefield, with the same sense of invincibility. Instead, they would be more cautious, more aware of their enemy's capabilities, and more focused on adapting to changing circumstances. The skies over North Vietnam, especially on August 23, 1967, became a testbed for one of the most pivotal and unexpected moments in the history of aerial combat. It was a place where technology, tactics, and sheer will collided in a way that no one could have predicted, especially not the American forces who had long considered themselves the undisputed masters of the air. This day proved to be more than just a simple clash of fighter jets. It was a statement, one that reverberated through the corridors of military strategy and still echoes in the doctrine of air forces across the world today. The North Vietnamese Air Force, NVAF, was heavily outnumbered and outgunned, a force with far fewer resources than the United States Air Force, USAF. Yet, in the sweltering skies of North Vietnam, the NVAF demonstrated that brute force and technological superiority do not always guarantee victory. Instead, it was their ability to adapt, deceive, and outthink the more advanced American forces that allowed them to land a stunning victory. On that fateful day, they didn't just survive, they outsmarted the USAF in a way that no one had expected, turning the tide of air combat with a combination of strategy, deception, and the precise execution of a well-laid trap. For the United States, this ambush was a wake-up call, an undeniable proof that their superior technology and firepower were not infallible. The USAF had long been accustomed to flying high over North Vietnam, confident in their technological edge. The F-4 Phantom, with its advanced radar, missiles, and speed, was an icon of military might. Yet in the complex and unpredictable environment of North Vietnam's skies, the Americans were humbled by an enemy who used intelligence and timing rather than sheer firepower to turn the fight in their favor. The ambush on August 23rd shattered the myth of invincibility and demonstrated that the outcome of a battle is determined by far more than the weapons in hand. For the pilots involved, the engagement was an intense and brutal lesson in the unforgiving nature of war. The F-4 Phantom pilots, despite their years of experience, found themselves suddenly on the defensive, grappling with an enemy that had turned their strengths into vulnerabilities. The MiG pilots, on the other hand, knew the terrain intimately. They understood the psychological aspects of combat and used it to their advantage. The NVAF pilots weren't just trying to outfly their enemies, they were playing a high-stakes game of psychological warfare, tricking the USAF into following them into a prepared trap. As the engagement unfolded, both sides faced the brutal realities of combat. For the American pilots, it was a stark reminder that no amount of technology can replace the need for adaptable, innovative tactics. For the Vietnamese pilots, the victory was not just one of pride. It was the culmination of years of careful study, practice, and understanding of their adversaries' weaknesses. They had succeeded not by matching the Americans in terms of firepower, but by exploiting the inherent flaws in the USAF's assumptions about the battlefield. This engagement also provided valuable insights into the true nature of air combat. Technology might provide an edge, but it is strategy, adaptability, and knowledge of one's environment that often leads to success. The North Vietnamese MiG pilots, despite having far fewer resources, had one thing that the Americans couldn't match in those skies: an intimate understanding of the geography, the culture, and the psychology of the fight. They were masters of deception, using false radar signals, decoy aircraft, and well-timed maneuvers to create a sense of overconfidence in the American pilots. When the Americans finally bit the bait, they found themselves in an ambush that had been set from the very beginning. For future generations of military strategists and pilots, the Battle of August 23, 1967, is studied not just for the tactical maneuvers that were used, but for the broader lessons about the nature of warfare. The first and most important of these lessons is that no force, no matter how technologically advanced, can afford to underestimate its opponent. Even when outmatched, an enemy that understands how to use deception and exploit the terrain can still win the day. The second key lesson is that war is not just a matter of firepower. Tactics, planning, and psychological warfare are just as important as the weapons in the arsenal. The success of the North Vietnamese ambush was not just a result of their aircraft or missiles, but their ability to deceive, mislead, and misdirect the Americans into positions of vulnerability. This was a victory won through cleverness, not brute force. And finally, the engagement serves as a reminder of the unpredictable and often chaotic nature of combat. Even the most meticulously planned operations can be upended by the human element. Despite their technological superiority, the American pilots were ultimately no match for the North Vietnamese MiG pilots, who proved that sheer numbers, resourcefulness, and ingenuity can still prevail over advanced technology when applied with precision. This battle left a lasting mark on both the USAF and the NVAF, forcing the Americans to rethink their strategies and assumptions about air superiority. The results of the engagement also bolstered the morale of the North Vietnamese, who now saw that they could go toe-to-toe with the most advanced air force in the world and come out on top. The victory didn't just shift the balance of power in that particular engagement. It sent a ripple of confidence throughout the NVAF and to the ground forces that depended on their support. In retrospect, the events of August 23, 1967, were not just an isolated incident in the Vietnam War. They became emblematic of a broader shift in military thinking, one that emphasized the importance of tactics, adaptability, and psychological acumen over raw technological superiority. The United States learned the hard way that victory in war is not always guaranteed by the sheer might of one's arsenal. Instead, success in combat is often determined by the ability to think on your feet, to recognize opportunities where others see none, and to exploit the enemy's weaknesses in ways they can't anticipate. For military historians and tacticians, the August 23rd ambush remains a crucial lesson in the complex dynamics of warfare. It continues to be studied in military academies around the world, providing insight into the strategic use of deception, the importance of knowing one's environment, and the need for constant adaptation. The engagement is an example of how a smaller, less equipped force can use intelligence, strategy, and terrain to overcome a far superior opponent. Ultimately, the skies over North Vietnam on that day became not just a battlefield, but a canvas upon which the NVAF painted a picture of ingenuity, deception, and audacity. It was a victory that went beyond the physical destruction of American aircraft. It was a victory that resounded on a deeper level, proving that the lessons of history, tactics, deception, and adaptability are just as important as the weapons we wield. The battle may have been fought more than half a century ago, but its lessons continue to shape the way we understand warfare to this day.